So we're here to talk through the Statue Park puzzle by Murat. Even if you didn't read the title, it's pretty clear from the start that there's a theme that's using the four corners of the grid, and that's because in a statue park you can't isolate white cells, and very much while they're not clued, the extreme corner cells can't be white because they would cause immediate isolation of a single white cell from everything else. The black cells that surround it form this pattern. The blacks here look to be somewhat limiting, and there's always a case that the pentomino shape, while it has a lot of options for a given pattern, it may not have a lot of options where we have a pentomino shape that has this kind of three-cell corner cluster. And let's sort of think about what are the shapes that it can be. If it takes this middle cell, this fourth cell of a 2x2 square, like this cell here, there's only one pentomino as a whole that has a 2x2 square in it. That's a P, so P is an option. And in the case where it doesn't use this cell at all, we can sort of think of two ways the pentomino could grow. It could grow on just one of the two sides. So say it took this cell as a fourth and took one more, it would be an L, one more would be a U, or it could grow on both sides, and that would be a V. And so I'm seeing at the start that there are effectively four shapes, and only four shapes, that use this corner pattern. And I've got four corners that have that pattern. So in some stage, while I don't actually know where they are, for the purposes of this puzzle, I'll just view like the corner cells are these PULV, whatever that means, where this could be a P or an L, but these interior ones, the things I haven't worked with yet, are not part of those groups. And so that will give me some starting points. Like down here, it looks like when I start to put this in, two cells shaded, if this were shaded, it's going to come up and form another L. That's no good, so we can quickly exclude certain things by knowing that while we haven't placed them yet, the corners are going to be these four shapes. One thing that I do as I start to see any pentomino growing out is make sure that I have enough room to keep it growing, and this looks to be pretty constrained going to the right. If I actually took this cell, whites have to immediately surround it on all sides. So this could be a third cell of this group, but it's got to come to the left as well, and this will be a forced fourth cell. And once the whites sort of escape being pinned, this will be a forced fifth cell, and so this will be a W or an F pentomino shape, but it must take these. This clue here can't connect to this pentomino to the left. It would be too large to reach all the way there, but it also can't, say, take a close cell like this, because that would really strand white. So it could take as many as two, 1, 2, 3. It must take a fourth and fifth. And I'm actually seeing if it took both of these, it would make a P shape, and the P shape, as we know, is in the corner. So it's got to take a fourth cell, thinking it can only take as many as one of these. And it actually can't take this cell, because that would make an L shape, and the L shape's in the corner. So in some case, if you view this like a corner cell, you don't want to remake the corner pattern. This sort of three-cell pattern that's on a hard edge. I think we're going to run into that again, because it's a pretty easy pattern to see when you're starting to form it, so we'll watch out for it. We make an F here. We start to get a lot more limitation for this group. These three cells can't join to this clue up there. That would make a group as large as 6. So it actually is forced to be the P shape, so we'll mark this off as now in the grid. These white cells have to extend and get out, which means this black clue has to keep extending, which means these cells on the edge have to keep extending. These three are starting to form something that could be like a V shape, but the V shape is in the corner. So this is white. This now is a 1x4 that could become an L, but that's a corner pattern, or an I. So the only real option it actually has is an I. That's interesting, so we'll put that in the grid. These two are set up again just like a corner pattern, and what that means is if this cell weren't used and we took these ones, we formed another corner which would take a U shape or an L shape, and those aren't available to us anymore. So we've got to avoid making a corner pattern with these three cells shaded and know where to go further to the left or further down. Those options are going to be pretty limiting. So these are all used. The cell isn't used because that would be a P. This isn't used because that would be a U. These have to extend. the cell comes over, and if it went one more over, it would isolate whites, so this has to come up, get a W shape just now in the grid. Got this group here. We've put in the I, so this now is forced to be the Y, which is helpful to see. There's probably something to do here, but let me actually come back to these clues. We've put a little bit around, I guess this clue at the start could never have been a V. This could have been a P, U, or L. And now that the P's in the grid, this is a U or L. And down here, I've now marked this cell as white, so I've removed the V option from it. So this is also U or L. So with the P in the grid and the U and L in the other corners, got a little bit of intelligence that this upper left pentomino is the V. And that's exactly in the grid. This clue now, if it did not take this cell to the left, is going to be making a sort of tall shape, which is L or I-like. L and I are in the grid, so it's got to take this cell. If it takes the cell here, it forms a Y, but that's in the grid. If it takes a cell, it's a V, but that's now in the grid. So it's going to form this N. And so we've got this done, this done. We have a case where we've got three 3x3 bounded pentominoes left to place, and U and L, which are these corner, and a lot of white space. So there's not going to be a case in this puzzle where I can just look at a shape like an X and suddenly place it. But what I think looks to be important is probably keeping this right side of the grid connected to the left side of the grid. And so I'm just doing a kind of quick inventory. If I think about shapes like a T shape, T could look like this, but that's going to isolate all the white cells here. Once we really shade this cell, we're in a problem. So let's actually look at that. If this were black, it can't connect to this group, so it's got to take this cell. This would then form a barrier to the right, so this has to be white. And for then the other shapes this can be, let's say it doesn't connect to this group as part of the L. If this were part of a pentomino that's left, a T, it's going to have to be in a 3x3 bounding box, so effectively it's going to have to be in this box. And it's not an X, it's not a T, it could be a Z. But if it's a Z, we again now have joined with this cell, this cell, this cell, a black wall that's isolating whites. So I think it's pretty much the case that this black does not have the space to be part of a 3x3 pentomino. It's not a T, a Z, or an X. That means it's got to be part of a U or L, and it's not part of a U if this corner is a U. So that corner has to be an L. And this is a tricky limitation, but a connectivity limitation that looks like it's going to force a lot of the rest of the grid. We still got a ton of white space and not a lot of black clues. But we have 3 shapes to go, and I'll just mark these off. 3 shapes to go and some different options for them. So let's start with the one that we've even started any part of. Is this an X shape? No, it would isolate these whites. Is this a T shape? Maybe. This shape looks okay. This shape does not, because it isolates these cells. And if it's a Z shape, it's got to be in a 3x3 bounding box, and it's got to turn after doing this, so it'd have to be this. So this is not a Z, not an X. It can be a T, and the only T that's valid is this one. So we'll mark all these in. This is not, with a Z and X as the 2 shapes looking at, this isn't used, this isn't used. You can start to get Z shapes from up here. I think there are a few ways to do this. There's a whole lot of white space, so this is going to be a case in a puzzle where we're really excluding all bad options to find the single good option. So what I'm going to do is look at X as the most constrained pentomino of these 2. At least it will always, if we know where its center cell is, we know where all its cells are. So I'm just going to look at potential center cells for the X just quickly and not sort of think about any consideration except that I can make the plus shape looking at the whites. And so these are all shapes that allow for an X like that. Some of them you can rule out instantly. This cell, for instance, if this were shaded and makes this shape, it isolates that white cell. Same for this one, it would isolate this white cell. If some of these middle ones are used, the thing we're going to have to watch for is that we leave enough space for a Z to fit in, and a Z has to be in a 3x3 box and use 2 opposite corners. And so if, for instance, I use this middle pattern here, what that does is leaves everything to the upper right and lower right as too small for a Z, and it doesn't leave a 3x3 box over here. And so my guess is that most of the other options we have are going to kill off enough of 3x3 shape. So if like this X were used, it again is going to mark as white some of these cells. We're left with just this as a 3x3 box, but a Z can't go in this box. It would be one of those patterns, but those all collide. If this were the X, there's no 3x3 box that's left over that has corners for a Z. If this were used, that now marks off as white everything sort of lower left of this. So there's a potential for a Z up here, either of these Z's up here, but those Z's are going to isolate the right side of the grid. So this is no good. So I think we're down to these two options. And trying to do this, again, like it's visually easy just in your head, but trying to figure out if there's a clean way to isolate which it is. And I think it's again going to come back to that theme of not isolating the right side of the grid. So let's take this extreme as the X. It now is going to have whites sort of everywhere along this diagonal. So we've got this not being a possible Z position because effectively it's got a white here, here. So it can't get up or over enough. So the Z has to be in the square. And in the square, it can take these cells but form a thing that divides, or take these three cells. So it would have to take these three cells. And it takes these three cells with the X in these cells, follow this path, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those are all black, and that isolates this topmost group. And so this, again, pretty tricky elimination, maybe best done by pencil, but that is not a possible X. And with just kind of mentally mapping the X shape, this looks to be the only X that's possible. I'll put it in. And it does leave enough room on the right side to get the whites out. And when we put in these diagonal things, we're left with one 3x3 bounding box. And with this corner in white in a 3x3 bounding box, it has a Z. We have to use the two opposite corners. So these are the only two opposite corners that can be shaded. This is the center, so this is the necessary part of a Z pattern. These whites have to connect out to the rest of the grid, so we mark those, and that now forces just one orientation for the last Z. So pretty tricky ending to show logically, but a challenging ending for a challenging puzzle that had a really interesting start with this corner set of clues, giving us a PU, L, and V shape that were forced to the corners. That gave a lot of ways we could work through the middle clues to form these intermediate shapes by dodging L's or dodging V's or dodging other shapes that have to be in the corner. Once we got a lot into the grid, we were trying to figure out how to not isolate the white cells getting out from the right side. That got us the identity of this corner as an L. And then we ended up with 3 pentominoes to place, first a T that we could make uniquely, and then just an exploration in white space of Z and X. So fairly challenging puzzle, but hope you learned a little bit about how to think of the pentomino inventory and common patterns, including the pattern identified here of like 3 cells shaded that are on the edges of the grid that would pop up in different spots as things to keep avoiding. Those will be ways you can start to visualize enough of the shapes to think ahead of your puzzle when solving a statue park or other pentomino challenge. So hope you learned something from this discussion, and we'll see you again soon.